and business are vulnerable to the loss of control over the data and also potential threat of their intellectual property and also the ability to shape and enforce legislation in the digital environment. The US and China are the world's first and the second largest digital economy and lead the world in the value of many digital applications. So we see the technological competition between the two is reflected in the overall US-China strategic competitions. For example, I read a document or a commentary yesterday which argues that the US needs a digital Marshall Plan to counter Chinese digital Silk Road. And certainly there's also counter argument. So we really want to expand more on this ongoing debate through today's panel. This panel will be moderated by Dr. Liu Yawei. Dr. Liu is the director of China program at Carter Center, and he has written substantially on the US-China relations and facilitated a lot of discussion and debate on the bilateral relations. Dr. Liu is also a senior member of the advisory board of ICAS. We have 4 distinguished speakers today. You can have their full bios on the website. I'm going to very briefly introduce each one of them. We have Mr. Paul Trillo. He's the practice head of geotechnology on Eurasia Group. He leads the firm's newest practice and focuses on global technology policy issues, cybersecurity, intergovernance, among others. Ms. Amy Curran, she's a fellow of Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and she's also the instructor at Stanford University and also Duke Corporation Education. She's a global competitive strategy consultant and 5G thought leader and advises many Western-based companies and government on how to compete in the new global economy given China's rise in this area. Dr. Yang Nan, he's the research fellow at the Institute of American Studies with Chinese Academy of Social Science. CAS is one of the leading research institutions and think tank in China. He has released multiple publications related to the intersection of cyberspace and militarization. And Dr. Danish Simon, he's a senior advisor to the President for China Affairs at Duke University and also professor of China Business and Technology at Duke's Ford School of Business. Dr. Simon is also a senior advisor to ICA's Trade and Technology Program. Without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Liu to moderate the discussion today. Dr. Liu.
Thanks, Dr. Hongno. When I was in graduate school 20-some years ago, one essay we were asked that, if you're majoring in American history, you have to read that essay. And that essay is called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. So today we are discussing another frontier, not just in American history, but in the history of U.S.-China relations, in the current rivalry between the U.S. and China. So as Dr. Hong mentioned, we have 4 very distinguished panelists. So without further ado, we're going to go to Paul to start his initial remarks. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yawei, and thanks for the Carter Center and ICAS for hosting this panel at a very timely moment in U.S.-China relations. It seems like we could say that almost every day over the last 2 years. So I think it's important to. I'll just try to provide a little bit of context here. My company advises many multinationals and particularly in the technology domain about global technology policy, and of course, U.S.-China relations has been sort of at the forefront of our advisory, if you will, for the last 2 to 3 years, given the trajectory that we've seen in U.S.-China relations. So I think one of the most difficult parts of the relationship is technology policy. And I think that's because it touches on so many different issues, things like military modernization and human rights and Taiwan, to name just a few. I think what we've seen in the Biden era, if you will, is a carryover of some of the really critical themes that sort of came to the fore in the Trump era. And again, those have precedents going back before Trump, but some of the themes that have been picked up and sort of remain central to this issue of U.S. China technology competition are things like this perception that state capitalism in China has significantly benefited Chinese tech companies to the detriment of competition in certain arenas. Also that China is leveraging access to U.S. technology for military modernization, for example, in a way that people in Washington now sort of take more concern or are more concerned about. And also that this broader meme, which I think is going to be really difficult to make progress on, that the U.S. and China are locked in a strategic sort of rivalry over the next decade for advanced technologies, particularly things like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and also critically that the perception that China is going to misuse, the Chinese government will misuse some of these technologies in ways that Washington and other allies may find of concern, and so that's a really big. Those memes are sort of current in the Washington, what people sometimes call the Washington consensus around U.S. China. So technology is certainly central. It's not the only issue in U.S. China relations, of course, but I think it touches on so many areas that it really is one of the central factors going forward as we look ahead. So if we look at some of the continuity from the Trump era, for example, we see that the Biden team has continued to push things like export controls, particularly on Chinese companies like Huawei. And it has added other Chinese companies to some of the many lists that are now maintained in various parts of Washington. Chinese companies, for example, on the entity list, the dreaded Commerce Department entity list, so that since the Biden team has come in, for example, they've added critically companies like Phytium, which is a big Chinese maker of semiconductors and CPUs. In addition, the Biden team has taken some of the policy choices that were made in the Trump era and tried to put them on a sounder legal basis. And so, for example, in the Trump era, we saw the designation of Chinese companies as associated with China's China's military industrial complex. So this was a designation that prevented, for example, U.S. investors from investing in those firms on U.S. markets. And so that's been a big issue. We can talk more about that, but that has dragged the financial sector also into the U.S. China tech competition, if you will. And so now the Treasury Department, for example, is responsible for maintaining and sort of implementing this list of Chinese companies associated with the military. And then the other big issue that came up late in the Trump era is this issue about data security. And so the Biden team has revoked the executive orders issued about almost a year ago that would essentially have banned TikTok and WeChat, two large Chinese social media companies, from operating in the U.S. But those executive orders were challenged; those bans were challenged in court, and so the Biden team is looking for ways to put those again on a sounder legal basis. And so I think in the coming months we'll see movement on that area, because the issue of data security and government access to data is a huge one that is of great concern to the U.S. government. But they're trying to find new ways to implement those things. There are two new really big areas too that the Biden team is also pursuing, and we're right in the middle of these. One is this idea that hinges on what National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has called the need for the U.S. to operate from a position of strength vis-a-vis China. And so we've seen this big emphasis on domestic innovation in the U.S., supporting, for example, the onshoring of advanced semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S. And this is a big focus. Will be a big focus in Congress, which is considering several large bills, all with a China nexus, which will provide funding for onshoring and manufacturing and for U.S. R&D, all with the sense of competing with China, the need to compete with China and sort of China's state backing of a lot of efforts in the tech sector. The second piece is alliance building, which is just getting off the ground. This is establishing some mechanisms for the U.S. To collaborate with allies via the G7, via the Quad. But we think that most of the action will be with the EU, initially at least, with the EU-U.S. Trade and Technology Council, which I would add is going to be more tech than trade. And so at the end of the month, we're going to see a big meeting of the ministers on both sides. The U.S. side is led by Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, Secretary of State Blinken, and USTR Catherine Tai. And that's going to look at establishing initially some deliverables around some of the 10 working groups that have been established under this so-called TTC, Trade and Technology Council. And that's going to be a big deal also for China, because will all be viewed from Beijing as yet another effort by the US to sort of contain China's rise as a tech power, because all of these working groups are looking at aspects of technology, competition, investment reviews, export controls, supply chains, data governance. So we can talk more about that too, but that's going to be a big thing going forward. I think on the U.S. side, one of the concerns that we've been looking at is sort of how coherent the U.S. policy will be around these trade and technology issues. There have been some, up until now, there have been some key positions, for example, in the U.S. government bureaucracy that haven't been filled. The U.S. government, the Biden team has moved to fill those quickly. There'll be some key export control positions filled in the coming weeks at the Commerce Department, for example. But you do have a sort of structural issue, which is that as the U.S. embarks on this competition with China more broadly, the U.S. hasn't done industrial policy for some time, and so this is really what we're talking about. Is one of the ways to compete with China is to do industrial policy potentially light, as we've been calling it, but this is going to definitely be a fixture of U.S. policy going forward, as seen by some of the congressional actions and funding of new technology initiatives. And so this is tricky, though, because the U.S. doesn't have a METI like in Japan, and so there's been a lot of call for making the Commerce Department into sort of a ministry of industrial policy. We'll see how that evolves over time, and how those muscles are exercised in terms of a long-term, taking a long-term view of this. Because, for example, in the semiconductor sector, to reduce U.S. dependence on Taiwan and TSMC, for example, in the context of U.S. China tech competition, that's a 10-year at least process. And so this is something that's going to take time and attention. And the U.S. government structurally is not well suited to doing this for the long term. And then the second issue is going to be sort of on the trade and technology alliance piece, again, establishing structures that are going to be more than just talk shops to decide how to deal with some of these issues around tech policy with China in a more allied sense. Because again, you're talking about coordinating things like industrial policy around complicated issues like semiconductor supply chains, which may be one of the big initial topics that's discussed at the TTC. And again, how does the U.S. sort of sustain and the EU sustain a sort of high-level focus on these kinds of issues going forward? I think in the short term, just finally, we're going to see some tactical moves in the U.S.-China relationship coming out. We've seen the Biden Xi call last week, which was people focused quite a bit on, and that was a really important call because that had been 7 months since the two leaders had talked. I think the optics of that were really bad from senior leadership on both sides. There was a lot of talk about climate change and cooperation. Beijing does not seem ready to cooperate in one area like climate change, while the rest of the relationship is all about confrontation. And I think in the coming weeks, we're going to see really more steps on confrontation. It looks like the USTR, for example, will launch another 301 investigation around subsidies. This is one of the big issues of tech policy that came out of the trade discussions that were the sort of focus of China policy in the Trump era. And that's going to not go over well in Beijing, because that will be something, again, that will include potentially punitive things like tariffs coming out of that investigation. And then we'll probably also see further moves in areas like export controls, and as I mentioned earlier, around things like data and tackling the problem of Chinese apps operating in the US. So I think as we look forward, we don't see a lot of bright spots in US-China relationship. What we do see is more tactical moves in some of these areas that I mentioned that will also complicate the relationship more broadly. But I think, again, the tech policy piece of this is really critically important, and happy to discuss in more detail any of the issues that I raised. And thanks again for holding this panel at this very timely moment in U.S.-China relations.
Thanks, Paul, for that very macro context of where U.S.-China technological relationship is. Despite the phone call on September the 10th, your remarks suggest there doesn't appear to be light at the end of the tunnel. So we'll see. Now we're moving on to Amy to see where she comes from. Amy?
Hi, yes. So thank you. I am delighted to be here. So for the past decade, and more specifically since I published my book, The China Factor, 5 years ago, I've been beating this drum on global competitiveness and specifically what the West needs to do to better compete with China. I am more than delighted to see some of these moves that Paul has highlighted. The U.S. especially is starting to take action, and this is terrific. So where I'm coming from, as you ask, is really, I wrote the book based on my firsthand experience in leading the Huawei war room at Cisco in the early days when Huawei was just emerging on the telecom scene. That's when we started realizing that there was a different form of competition globally, and how do we react to that? And as well, being a 5G thought leader, and currently working on the operator side, I'll focus my discussion points around the intersection of 5G, global competitiveness, national security, economic security, and geopolitics. And of course, yes, it's a long list, but the collision of, I think, all of these elements is a big reason why we find ourselves in these especially challenging times with China today. So I'm going to start with an experience I had last year. I was honored and also gratified meaning really grateful to see the UK making a move on this. But the UK Parliamentary Committee had invited me to contribute to their committee on 5G infrastructure. So generally the theme is, now that they've banned Huawei as a 5G provider, what do they do? Right? What do they do now? So I'm going to highlight some of these questions and answers from this dialogue, because I think they're relevant to Canada as well as the USA. And like I said, I think the movement has started on some of these recommendations, but I just want to reiterate. So just a bit of background to set the stage, right? We all know that USA started a campaign over a year ago, maybe two, imploring other Western nations to not deploy Huawei equipment for their 5G networks because it posed a national security concern. One reason fueling this was China's national intelligence law that they instituted in 2017. So the potential repercussions, of course, of not heeding this guidance from the USA included the US not working with those nations potentially in the future. And if you were a Five Eyes member, which Canada is, you may be cut off from privileges, was the proposition. So the USA took a further defensive position, right, by cutting off China, and Paul told us about this, right, and Huawei more specifically, for the much needed chips that they needed to continue their leadership in growth in 5G. And to support this initiative, they even sacrificed their own American companies like Qualcomm, for example, which depended on China for over 65% of their revenues. So it was definitely a very strong defensive position, while in parallel they started, their more offensive strategic planning. So all this to say, the UK then reevaluated their 5G strategy and subsequently decided to ban Huawei, not only for national security reasons, but also for supply chain dependency threats. So in other words, if Huawei was being squeezed by the USA, would Huawei still be a sustainable solution in the future? It wasn't worth the investment risk. So this led to the UK saying, okay, so what do we do now? That only leaves two other top vendors in 5G networking equipment to choose from, i.e. Ericsson and Nokia. And what 5G solution should we deploy, they ask, right? Is this a prudent dependency? Right now, we're dependent on only two vendors. And by the way, they scratch your head, why aren't we, the UK, a significant player in this globally important 5G technology? How do we get out of this quandary, and how do we catch up? Okay, so these same challenges are shared by the USA and Canada, Canada being the farthest behind among these three in taking action on the 5G gap. And as most of us know, right, this is due to the geopolitical tensions and other issues that I don't want to digress us on right at this moment. And so they are the last of the Five Eyes in taking a stance on Huawei. So let's take a look at what caused these nations to be so behind in 5G. Like why is there all this tension? Why is there all this catch up? Why is there this impetus? So the short answer is really that because the UK, Canada, and the USA took their eye off the 5G ball or opportunity, right? So different systems between East and West, or some of the West, because Nokia and Ericsson are Western companies, led to a 5G competitive gap, and that's fueling a lot of this this contention. So their systems no longer support them in competing with China's different system, and essentially need to be tweaked, right? So my premise has long been the West needs a new playbook. Why? So let's take a look a little bit why. What is so broken, or what has not led us to be competitive, especially in 5G? First, free markets or the capitalism models failed them in 5G. Paul alluded to this a little bit, right? But they let free markets decide if they wanted to play in 5G networking equipment markets. So the private sector, of course, is driven by short-term financial objectives imposed by Wall Street or the stock markets in respective nations, which want to see significant financial returns on a quarterly basis. And they do not reward long-term strategic investments, at least not very often. For example, I mentioned that I work for Cisco. The USA's Cisco was beholden to shareholders and a 65% margin on their goods sold. And mobile wireless equipment, especially the radio part, do not support that goal. So they passed on the 5G equipment manufacturing opportunity from the radio access side, right? That's the most expensive. It requires a lot of R&D and the margins are very low. And then, of course, Canada let its telecom crown jewels, Nortel, declare bankruptcy in 2009 instead of just bailing them out for a mere $2 billion of economic could have been justified for economic security reasons. And a similar demise happened for the UK telecom vendors. Second, these nations, these three, were lacking in a national long-term vision or strategy that supports economic security and ultimately national security. China has Made in China 2025 and an ongoing 5-year, 10-year plan that's updated regularly. However, these Western countries, and as Paul mentioned, need more industrial policy to close this gap and ensure that they.
Amy, you froze. While we're waiting for her to come back, let's move to Dr. Yang. Dr. Yang, why don't you just go ahead? We'll see when Amy is going to come back.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Liu. And thanks to ICAS Scholar Center for giving me such a great chance to participate in this webinar, as well as offering me an opportunity to learn and exchange opinions with my counterparts across the ocean. It is quite valuable, especially under the current circumstances. Well, as we have seen that in recent years, the relations of China and the United States have become much more sensitive, and many, bilateral topics have turned into areas with potential conflicts. And the digital technology is, of course, of primary importance. And during Trump administration, the United States clearly positioned China as a substantial opponent in the high-tech field, and then launched a tech war. We have seen export controls against companies such as ZTE and Huawei, cutting off the connection between TikTok and its parent company ByteDance, and of course the clean network operations. And China has also been forced to take some countermeasures, and the relationship between these two sides in this field has taken a sharp turn. And after President Biden came into power, the tech war has evolved into an extended technological competition with a new trend of United States trying to use the power of its allies to suppress China. And just as Paul mentioned, after G7 meeting, the Technology and Trade Council has been established, which include more than 10 specific task forces covering almost all high-tech topics. And meanwhile, digital elements have appeared more or less in bilateral sensitive areas, including Hong Kong, Xinjiang, South China Sea, and of course, cybersecurity. And I believe it is quite meaningful to discuss digital frontier of the United States and China during this very moment. But before we start this discussion, a critical question arises here. I would like to borrow the title of a book from a famous American writer, Raymond Carver, which is what we talk about when we talk about digital frontier. There have already been large numbers of discussions around the digital technology advancement and their impact on Sino-United States relations, which could easily make the audience confused. And in my opinion, any discussion about the digital frontier between China and the United States, well, basically covers four aspects, namely the economic and trade, the technical, the political, and the security. And of course, they are not isolated from each other. With this framework, we can easily explore any specific topic in the digital frontier. And today I would like to choose data, which I think is the most basic, but also the most important element of digital frontier. Well, in recent years, major digital powers, including China and the United States, has not only regarded the data as new oil, but a kind of strategic assets, which a global data war is starting to take shape. China and the United States are undoubtedly at the center of this war. And from the economic and trade perspective, the United States has always emphasized the concept of free flow of data, no matter within or across the borders. Well, however, this is also a global trend of data sovereignty, which China have embraced these years. And the willingness of countries to cooperate in the digital field has been further reduced. According to statistics from UNCTAD, a figure shows that since 2008, G20 countries have successfully implemented more than 6,600 data protection measures as of the beginning of 2021. 128 of the 194 countries have introduced the various data sovereignty legislations, well, accounting for almost 66% of the total. And among them, the most representative ones are China's cybersecurity law, and of course, European Union's GDPR. Difference of concept of data governance between China and the United States, well, undermine their potential further cooperation. And for a technical perspective, the number of high-tech cooperative projects between China and the United States has jumped from a cliff. Well, a digital technology barrier has again formed, and intellectual property, which Paul had just mentioned, has again become a conflict point. The United States is trying to block the critical data flow of China, as well as prevent Chinese technology companies from accessing and obtaining users' data in the United States. And what we saw in TikTok and ByteDance cases. At the same time, the United States government also instigates a desynchronization, and then in 2018, United States government carried out another round of export control reform, and the National Security and Personal Data Protection of 2019 strengthened the Committee on Foreign Investment. Well, from a political perspective, as we all know that the virtual giants have obtained huge profits with their algorithm in these years. And this process has always been at the expense of personal privacy and users' data. This would probably form a new, well, digital industrial complex, which Tim Cook himself has described as privacy at the Privacy and Data Protection Summit this year. Both Chinese and the United States government suffered from this process and started a campaign to constrain this behaviors. However, this is a certain degree of difference between the governance modes of these two countries. The United States released a federal data strategy, used the Congress more testimony, while Chinese government inclined to get more involved in the cooperation the corporation itself and restrain the giant's power from the top. From the last one, a security perspective, as the international law of cyberspace has stagnated in recent years, as well as the militarization of cyberspace process has gone on, the data has begun to show a trend of weaponization. The United States government is very worried about high and late collaborations, especially after 2016 election. And the Chinese government also believes that this swirly of data may have a negative impact on social stability. So it has begun to strengthen its governance on critical data, both for United States and China. And as time limits, I have to stop here, even though I want to share more about the four aspects I mentioned above. And for now, I see China and the United States may have more conflict in digital frontier than cooperation. And I cannot see any signs that these divergences could be reconciled. Well, I also believe that the digital process need to be managed and controlled in order to avoid further escalation. I also hope to have a further discussion about United States and China's data security and data governance. So thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to answer any questions. Mr. Liu.
Thanks, Dr. Yang. Amy, I don't know what happened, where she lives, just got into a storm or, so we'll wait, but Dennis, you're the cleanup hitter for our initial round, so the floor is yours.
Well, it's clear Canada needs some Huawei 5G technology.
I agree. Couldn't agree with you more.
Okay, well,
nice.
Again, let me thank the Carter Center and ICAS also for inviting me. And as everyone has said, this topic is very timely and also significant. I thought we've heard three very good macro, strategic perspectives on the bilateral relations. I thought I might talk about the digital economy inside of China and what's going on, so that we have some grounding a little bit in terms of what we're really talking about. And everyone agrees that digitalization is changing the global economy, and this is even more true in terms of the Chinese economy. Really, digitalization has taken hold throughout the economy, and if you look at things like not only 5G, but most important, the Internet of Things and the rapid spread of smart technology everywhere. The other night, we just heard a presentation about the company Haier, which is a white goods manufacturer, and Haier now is only talking about the smart kitchen and smart appliances, etc. And so we are now looking at a much more integrated approach throughout the Chinese economy about digitalization. And it shouldn't be really a surprise. When I look at this, there are a number of factors that have driven the emergence of the digital economy. Obviously, the large number of internet users in China, well over 800 million now, and approximately 20 or 25% of those reside in rural towns and cities, that this is an important part of integrating the entire Chinese economy. A second factor really is the establishment already of a well-functioning online ecosystem that many segments of the economy utilize and take advantage. The third is a increasingly sophisticated digital infrastructure that is already driven by 5G, and we're already looking at 6G. But as I mentioned, the Internet of Things is becoming increasingly a reality in China in terms of itself being a driver. The fourth thing would be Chinese consumers and business users. They've embraced the digital economy in terms of products and services, everything from the cashless economy to the smart kitchen. I think all of these things indicate that China has had a very receptive audience internally, and a number of the questions that have served as impediments in the West really have not, until recently, been critical issues. Another driver has been really in the area of financial technology, and I think that that's very, very important. China has built a almost seamless financial ecosystem, and it is now integrated businesses, consumers, government agencies, etc., into one largely integrated financial system. Chinese banks, for example, it's estimated on average they have somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 data points on consumers and merchants as they do their underwriting for loans and other financial instruments. That's a tremendous amount of data. Chinese banks are data deep, and they're getting this data from the usage patterns of Chinese consumers and businesses. And finally, the role of the government. Now, given the events of the last several months, this may sound strange, but up until that point, we were in somewhat of a Wild West situation. That is, the Chinese government had basically taken a fairly hands-off policy about the development of the digital economy. And it basically allowed for a lot of entrepreneurship, a lot of innovation, not only technological innovation, but business model innovation. All of that seemed to have taken hold until the last several weeks, starting, first with the intervention with Ant and the Ant IPO and spreading forward. What's also interesting about this is that we don't only have a digital economy in terms of these new industries, but also increasingly the digital economy has spread into Chinese traditional industries in the form of automation, robotics, et cetera, et cetera. So according to the Chinese Academy of Information and Communication Technology, the digital economy right now in China is about 1/3 of the PRC economy. But though this is taking the kind of broad definition that Dr. Yang sort of raised of what is the digital economy. And this would include everything from semiconductors and ICT and telecom to fintech payments, e-commerce, et cetera, et cetera. Using a more narrow definition of the digital economy, it's only about 8%, 10%. It really has not yet fully spread as fast as some of us think it is. But I think the most important thing is, up until, again, recently, the speed of the digitalization process has almost become accelerated. And I think the COVID-19 situation actually, many people thought might be detrimental to the economy. In China's case, I think it's actually helped to accelerate digitalization. And I think that that's something that we need to watch in the coming years ahead. Right now, Chinese e-commerce transactions account for over 40% of all global transactions in e-commerce. This is a huge number, and clearly a lot of data and information are moving through Chinese hands about what's going on in the world. Now, with this digitalization and the improvements in efficiency and the new modes of economic behavior, it's also has a tendency to also be very disruptive. And just like in the U.S. and Europe, we are contemplating the impact of digitalization on our labor force, on our work styles, et cetera. I think China has now begun also to take a look at the economic and social dislocations that are likely to occur because of this. I spent the last 5 years in Kunshan, and Kunshan is the site of a very large factory for Foxconn. And Foxconn, major assembler for Apple, as we all know, and several other companies. There used to be literally tens of thousands of workers in that Foxconn facility. But if you would go there today, what you would see a robot kingdom. Most of the factory now is automated, much fewer workers, and one wonders where all those migrant workers have gone in terms of the jobs that they once held, and what's that going to mean for the nature of the Chinese economy in terms of rural-urban gap and things of that sort. Another area I think that's really important to look at is the service sector, which is becoming, in effect, the new center of gravity in the Chinese economy. It's going to be positively affected by digitalization, no doubt, but also there are many uncertainties. And we're starting to see now, between the Chinese government and Chinese consumers, more and more concern about issues like privacy and data usage, et cetera. I think one of the biggest issues that China faces now when it looks at its future of digitalization, particularly when we look at things like artificial intelligence, is the quality of education, especially higher education, and whether or not China is going to be able to produce a large enough number of high caliber graduates who are going to be able to take on these digital jobs in the 21st century. This is a problem in the United States already. CISET in Washington, D.C. has produced a very, very interesting paper that talks about the numbers of AI and STEM PhDs coming out of China versus the U.S. Every year as an undergraduate level, China graduates 6 or 7 million undergraduates from its universities. But we already know that many of these graduates don't really measure up to the needs of Chinese companies or multinational companies. And this is going to be really critical if we looked at the trajectory of AI, machine learning, et cetera, et cetera. So while people like Li Kai-fu tend to be very confident about the spread and development of AI in China, I would argue that there are in front of the Chinese a bunch of technology constraints, legal issues, social issues, and skills issues that raise questions about how deep AI is going to penetrate. I think rather than seeing China as an AI juggernaut or an AI laggard, it's somewhere in the middle, and we need to better understand where progress is likely to be made and where there are likely to be constraints. Overall, if we would have ended this, we would have had this seminar about 6 months ago, I would have ended my presentation with a very optimistic assessment. I would have said that digitalization is going to bring more benefits, it's going to improve productivity and efficiency, et cetera, and it might even serve to help China over the hump as it moves from the factory to the world to the innovation services-oriented economy. But given what happened over the last 6 months and the government interventions into some of these areas, I think now all of a sudden we have a new scenario that's emerging, and one wonders what this picture ultimately is going to look like. As I suggested earlier, the so-called bat economy led by Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, things were really wide open. And it gave birth to a lot of other companies like Xiaomi, et cetera. All of these companies were part of this new technological or digital frontier that Professor Yang talked about. But with the recent crackdown by the Chinese government, the freewheeling atmosphere that existed now has been put and turned on its head. And I think this is something that raises a bunch of new questions. Now, we see a number of new laws and regulations being introduced that promise to reshape, I think, the nature and the design of the Chinese digital world. And I think we need to keep our eyes on what they mean and what's going to happen. The Personal Information Protection Law, which is due to come out on November 1st, on the one hand, it seems flexible and sometimes, vague. But on the other hand, it's also very consistent with Chinese policy-making style. Chinese leaders don't really know what's going to happen once they implement it, and they want to remain having lots of options in terms of being able to move through this new law and crack down where they think that they don't like what's happening, particularly in terms of distortions and end runs that are likely to occur. Professor Yang mentioned the issue of algorithms, particularly recommendation algorithms. I think Chinese consumers are becoming concerned about this. Alibaba, Amazon, those kinds of companies use those. And now there's a new law that will allow Chinese consumers to remove the keywords they're attached to their accounts so they can no longer be tagged and targeted the way that they've been. All of these discussions take on significance for two more reasons, and I'll close here with these two reasons. First, Xi Jinping's announcement about shared prosperity. The question really comes up is, what will all of these new laws, regulations, et cetera, mean for China's technological entrepreneurs? And in particular, how will they impact the nature of innovation in China, both business model innovation and technological innovation? And second, how will foreign businesses be affected by all of these? With the new level playing field supposedly in effect, foreign companies will have to adhere to all of these requirements if they want to have access. We know that China, as I think Paul mentioned, has a very stringent local data storage and border transfer set of policies in place. I personally witnessed these as the executive vice chancellor at Duke Kunshan University. The ability to move data about students and about policies, et cetera, was very, very much an issue on our agenda all the time. Now, going one step forward, I also want to just raise this issue, and that is that as we look at China's enactment of these new laws, policies, etc., there is always the question about to what extent will they affect China's global integration. And that is that, are we going to see more disarticulation with the world economy, or are we going to see more integration? And this is something I think that is bound to be a consequence of these policies that Paul, Amy spoke about earlier. And I also want to refer to here the Digital Silk Road initiative by the Chinese, because I think that that's not unimportant. There are 65 plus countries now that are working with Huawei and other Chinese companies in order to build out this so-called Digital Silk Road. And I would refer to you to a recent study by the Council on Foreign Relations, in which they talk about the transition in China away from just simply building roads and stadiums and hospitals to now more focus on technology and education in the Silk Road effort, and particularly the focus on the Digital Silk Road. This all could be very significant as we move forward. And I think this issue about global integration and global disarticulation, when it gets tied to questions like self-reliance, technical standards, etc., promises to be a very, very important area for us to gain a deeper understanding as we look into the future. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
I think you're on mute, Yahweh.
Thanks, Dennis. We're going to go back to Amy, who has some technical issues. I wonder whether you have Huawei or not, or Ericsson that they're using to access the webinar. But in any case, I think, Amy, you're talking about industrial policy at the time. And so hopefully you'll be able to finish, and then we'll get into the Q&A more. Amy?
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. And my huge apologies for the breakdowns. That's why I'm using my cell phone now. Maybe mobile wireless will be better than the wired now. Maybe it's a leapfrog. All right, so I was talking about industrial policy, and I think Paul had also touched on the same note, right? He called it industrial policy light. I call it industrial policy 2.0. But for it to work this time, that gap, it has to be a more amiable relationship between public sector and private sector. They really have to want to work together. They have to see the mutual value. And we have to kind of get over this whole complaint about playing favorites in the spirit of economic security and figuring out what is the best solution forward for the country to catch up, and then the rest of the companies can also reap the benefits thereafter. The third point I wanted to make is that those three nations, the UK, US, and Canada, became complacent or more risk averse when it came to innovation and commercialization. The West needed, I often say that the West needs to become innovative about innovation. So when you're number one, when you're the best, you kind of take it for granted that you'd be the innovation leaders for an indefinite amount of time. And what they didn't realize is that the East, or China more specifically, was catching up quickly, and they were learning from the US, from Canada, from the UK, from these Western innovation leaders. So part of the shortfall has been that one-way learning. China has done a tremendous job at learning from the West. They've sent like loads and loads of people to learn about, how to become, create a Silicon Valley, right? They'd go there, and when I was living in Silicon Valley, I'd see those literally busloads of people coming through. We talked to them at Stanford. Canada similarly establishing joint research initiatives to learn, because it was almost it's almost arrogant to believe that it's a mutual sharing when the learning doesn't go the other way. So that's what propelled China to be such a global economic strength in such a short amount of time. And that's what caught some of these nations off guard, right? So by China building, China was also very good at business model innovation, right? So they short-circuited the whole innovation process by building on innovations of the West and then creating a new innovation. I call it constructive innovation. We've heard about disruptive innovation, but the way they leapfrog forward is, so for example, Xiaomi and how they became a number 3 global player in mobile devices in the short amount of five years, which was unheard of before. Essentially, they took the iPhone look and feel, right? They used the Android operating system, and they even went as far as recruiting the vice president of product marketing at Google on the Android side, right, to propel it forward. But they didn't stop at just copying or replicating those components. They built and customized a specialized, localized model for the Chinese market. They had, very low, if almost no R&D required. They invested very little marketing because they leveraged WeChat in order to proliferate, et cetera. And they really took advantage of the fact that their users wanted to contribute to the evolution process. And having that perfect iPhone release, that we wait for every year or 2 years, they didn't do that. They said, our product is work in progress. We will take your input and we will update accordingly. So again, they've modified the model based on what the market will bear. And we as Western country, the US, Canada, UK, have to get better at that and then have to do some of that reverse learning. Hey, what is working for China? Why are they so strong? And what can we adopt as well? And then one more just last point, as I recommended to the UK Parliament, they need to do better at commercializing their innovation investments and ensure a return on investment, an ROI from their funding in innovation hubs and academic research. It's one thing to say that they're investing in innovation, but are we really doing a good job at the go-to-market aspect? Where is that fund? Where are those funds going? Is the government making sure that there's accountability, and are they really optimizing and maximizing those assets, intellectual property, academic research, et cetera? So, for example, by not having that private sector gap in Canada, the Canadian government is funding academics, and they are working with Huawei to fuel Huawei's R&D advancement, and that's one of the reasons why Huawei is number one in the world in terms of 5G technology. They were very smart at optimizing and maximizing the use of academic research. We in the West need to do better at that as well, as how can we monetize this intellectual capital? So just in conclusion, I think, how does the UK catch up in 5G? That was the original question or the premise at the beginning of my talk. The UK, Canada, and the USA need to collaborate and work together to re-vector these 5G competitive gaps and accelerate the respective catch-up times. All three of them, and especially Canada, are very far behind. They don't have a competitive play. They want to catch up. The USA is actually ahead of the game. They've started to foster some of the smaller companies. They're investing in O-RAN, et cetera. But really what could really optimize that acceleration or make that happen faster for all three nations is what I describe as maybe like a three-way joint venture amongst nations, and they contribute their core competencies. UK is very, UK and Canada are very intellectual, very good on the research side, and USA is very good at commercialization. Why not bring all of these assets and capital advantages together and figure out how do they work together in order to go to market, establish a 5G solution. Now, why is that? Not only just to make these nations, feel better about their economic security, but once we have that level of more comparative competition in 5G, then we will have, so-called peace, right? Maybe at this point, when all sides feel that they have a piece of the pie or a fair chance at that economic opportunity, will they maybe be able to figure out how do they collaborate a little bit more in a more, what I call a fair trade or co-opetition format? And I'll just pause there. Thank you for allowing me to continue.
Thanks, Amy. To complete what you have left, I think we're going to divide the next 30 minutes into two parts. Number one is we want the panelists probably to respond, to other panelists' remarks, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. I think, Paul, you want to make a comment on what Dennis talked about, the fintech and its impact on U.S.-China relations.
Yeah, thanks, Yao. I thought Dennis's comments were spot on and really critical to understanding this whole thing, because we're sort of in this world now where China's taking domestic action that's having an impact on its relationship with the U.S., for example, particularly in the financial sector. This is where we have a lot of clients, and every day I'm answering questions about this. And I think Dennis did a great job of laying out sort of what's happening in China from a regulatory point of view. We look at this as sort of these three big buckets. One is antitrust. We just saw today, for example, Ant, the FT put out a story. It's not really new, but Ant is going to have to break away its lending apps from Alipay, for example, and that's part of this longer-term antitrust effort in China to sort of make sure that people don't have to choose between either the Alibaba or the Tencent ecosystems. And then there's also this big issue of data security. We saw this, of course, in the DD case, and the issue of sort of how the Chinese government wants to get a handle on the data security piece and the data security law and the personal information protection law that Dennis mentioned. That's another big issue that's going to impact U.S. businesses and also China. And then the final theme is that common prosperity theme, which encompasses a lot of things. And basically, the bottom line is Beijing does not want to see financialization of the economy, and also critically wants to have more focus on hard tech or core tech. This came out of the 14th Five-Year Plan, a very critical theme. Basically, in this long-term confrontation with the U.S., Beijing feels like the economy needs to be hardened, and they need to gird for this 10-year struggle with the U.S. and over technology, and so can't have too many resources going into e-commerce and sort of not non-productive competition between some of the players. So those are the big themes I think they're driving that. But specifically, the financial sector I think is critical to understand, because it gets to some of the issues Dennis raised about the future of China's tech and innovation. Up until now, we've seen, of course, Chinese companies have free access to Western capital markets. And this has been huge, right? I mean, these companies, there's 250 companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange, for example, and the NASDAQ that generated a tremendous amount of revenue for those companies to help them modernize and globalize and increase their ability to expand globally. But we're in a critical point now where what we call this bad equilibrium is coming to home to roost. And this involves basically the fact that the Chinese companies and Beijing and the CSRC have not agreed over the past decade to allow Chinese companies to be audited in a sort of standard best practices that is done in the U.S. And this something has to give here. This bad equilibrium, for example, could not continue with China trying to continue to use capital markets but not having its companies adhere to the sort of common practices. So last year we saw the U.S. Congress pass the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, which calls for the SEC, for example, to start the time clock. We think it's already started. Chairman Gary Gensler of the Securities and Exchange Commission basically has hinted that the clock has started for a 3-year process of delisting if Chinese companies are not allowed to be subject to this auditing. This is a huge issue. And so at the same time, then the SEC has become concerned because of just those issues that Dennis raised over regulatory issues in China, that there's not enough regulatory transparency in the Chinese system. And so these companies are listing in the US, they're not revealing the regulatory risks. This was particularly the case with DD. And then finally, the other issue is the VIE structure, which these companies have used to list in the US. And so Chairman Gensler had a great tweet a couple of weeks ago where he showed the Cayman Islands, where many of these VIE structures are located. And he showed this turtle swimming out to the island, and he explained clearly what the U.S. concerns are with both the auditing issue, the VIE structure, and regulatory transparency around Chinese companies listing in the U.S. And so this is going to be a huge issue going forward, whether there's enough political will on both sides to resolve the auditing issue initially, and then how are Chinese companies going to be subject to U.S. restrictions if they don't provide more transparency around the VIE structure and around regulatory transparency. So I think this is going to be something that's really critical for China's modernization here, because the question then becomes, can China's domestic capital markets support the relisting or transfer of all these companies from U.S. stock exchanges? We've already seen China Telecom and China Mobile that were delisted because of that military-industrial complex list I mentioned earlier, relist on the STAR market in Shanghai with fairly big IPOs there. But the question is, are these markets mature enough in China, both in Hong Kong, probably pretty good Hong Kong, but not necessarily STAR in Shanghai, and this new market in Beijing, which Xi Jinping has hinted at, which is likely going to be focused on small and medium enterprises here. So it's a huge issue as to if the decoupling is going to move more forcefully into the financial sector, because there's no political will, for example, to resolve this auditing issue and to have Chinese companies be transparent. Where does this leave China's tech sector in terms of using and leveraging overseas capital markets? Plus, if you get a disorderly unwinding of those delistings in the U.S., what our clients are very interested in how that will happen. But the bigger issue here is that this also highlights some of the themes I mentioned earlier, which is that China has not lived up to its obligations, and reforms have sort of stalled. So with the WTO, that led in large part to the 301 investigation that was that took up most of the Trump administration. This idea that China has moved to try to establish some of these norms, joined the WTO, but has not taken the necessary steps internally to reform to sort of meet some of these obligations, their obligations internationally. And this definitely applies in the financial sector, where this auditing issue is something that clearly had to be changed here. And we could see Congress, for example, moving more aggressively to even reduce that timeline for delisting. So that's a big issue going forward to think about as to how does China adjust to this. How do these markets function in China? And are we at the end of the U.S. tech or Chinese tech companies being able to leverage U.S. capital markets to raise capital and grow? And that's a huge issue. And I think Dennis was absolutely spot on to raise that as an issue. And so we had this very close intertwining of Chinese regulatory actions with U.S. responses.
Dr. Yang, I think there are three Western perspectives being expressed. You represent the Chinese perspective. You have any clarification you want to make, or you want to respond, or you have questions for Dennis, Paul, and Amy? You're on mute.
Thank you, Dr. Liu, and thank you, Paul. Thank you, Amy. And I think these are some insightful questions and opinions. And I think I will give some of my personal observation on it. And just as Paul had mentioned, that some of the drastic actions to rein in Alibaba and Didi and practice or other things. I think, most of the Americans mainstream medias I've seen are very concerned about the political considerations behind these incidents. And I think most of them are not really smoking guns. In my opinion, we should see the general logic behind this bunch of things. And you see in recent years, with the rapid development of digital technology, and every country, including the United States, has shown a very contradictory attitude towards digital enterprises. Well, on the one hand, and these companies are at the core element for the country to strengthen its economic and trade competitiveness, and also the foundation of high-tech R&D. On the other side, the power of these companies keep expanding and more, and more or less erode the user's privacy, endangers national security, and even evolved into a digital Leviathan, which as described by Susanna Zoloff in her famous book, Surveillance Capitalism. And therefore, we have seen an interesting trend that the government tried their best to restrain the behavior of these companies domestically, while express no effort to give these companies a green light to participate in the global competition, both in the United States and China. Well, that reminds me an interesting cartoon in Chinese website. On China's website, and it shows a row of children lined up to wait for their injection, and the leading child is Ali, get injected and seemed very painful. And the remaining children are Tencent, Didi, etc. And looking at the first child in horror, it is also applicable to the 4 digital giants of Google Alphabet. Microsoft and Facebook in the United States. And I believe that the goal of this injection is not to kill, but to cure them, while bringing the digital trade, get rid of the Wild West and ready for the next global cooperation as well as competition. So that's my point. And looking forward for more questions.
Thanks. Dennis, you said you want to do a quick response?
Right. There's two points, one to Paul and one to Professor Yang. For Paul's point, the last point that he raises at the very end about WTO and China's adherence to and compliance, this is a really fundamental question, because we may be seeing real structural impediments to China's ability to go forward on the so-called WTO commitments. In other words, what we're seeing today is an expression of the limits to which China is going to allow the free capital markets to work themselves across borders. And WTO, implies, again, more global integration, more articulation with the world economy, and therefore less control in the hands of Beijing, whether it's for political or economic reasons. I think that we should have actually all been surprised just how far China was allowed to let this thing go up to now, and the fact that it's going to have to go even further, it raises lots of questions, really big questions. For Professor Yang, I mentioned this broad definition of digital economy and the narrow definition of digital economy. I think this is very important to understand which one seems to be favored inside of China, because a broader definition means that there are more things under the control of the government oversight. A more narrow definition means there are more things that can be left freewheeling. And so I'm wondering, which is your sense of where the center of gravity is with respect to this use of this perception of what is the digital economy?
Dr. Yang, you want to respond to that?
Yes, thanks for your question, Dr. Simons. And I think what you mentioned, the micro step of the economy of it's a kind of leading force of national security, and the micro step of the economy is all about the privacy, and also the market is also inside of their bargains, and I think the leading forces behind this are the government, public, and enterprises, and each government need to consider more about each side has its own considerations, and therefore every government is trying to find I think a balance between these two factors, and of course it is a long-term and a rough task, both the United States and China, and it is a kind of a statecraft. I think the country needs to adjust its strategies and policies within its political environment, and for this it is I think it is totally an internal political problem. I want to use my data knowledge to answer this question in a very tiny view. And this also explains that even though the United States and the European Union, we see that share the same ideology, they have performed very differently on digital or economy or data issues in recent years. And as for data, European Union have banned, as we see that, banned the United States and Europe Privacy Shield Agreement, and later introduced GDPR, which has been seen as the most stringent in human history. And the United States itself also at the exploratory stage, and the federal government has, which I mentioned, that introduced a overall strategy, and the state and local governments start to take the lead, and in sharp contrast to the aggressive stance of the United States as well as in Europe, China adheres to the principle of a kind of a sovereignty, well, in a traditional geographical thinking, and also emphasizes the cooperation among sovereign states should be the way. It should be the way to resolve extraterritorial matters, I think, and China has always stressed that foreign authorities should respect China's national sovereignty, such as in requesting data and also the economy side, as you mentioned. And I think this is a long-term thinking, just like a statecraft, and the government need to balance, and also the other leading forces need to balance, such as the public and enterprises. So that's my point, Dr. Simons.
Thank you. Amy, during your presentation, you said you used to work for Cisco. I wonder, the saga of Cisco in China, and also the lawsuits between Cisco and Huawei. Does that inform us about the current rivalry, technological rivalry between U.S. and China? Are there things that we can learn from the earlier experience of Cisco in China, and what's next? For this ongoing. I think that's also a question for Paul. I remember during the early month of the trade war, the China said, if push comes to shove, we're going to go after the Iowa farmers, and then we're going to go after Boeing, and then we're going to go after the Apple. China really hasn't gone to individual American companies. However, the U.S. side, you talk about the entity list and the dreadful list. Once you're on, there's nowhere for the company to go. So maybe Amy, you'll go first, and Paul will make a comment on the sort of strategies of the two sides. Amy.
So I'm going to assume you're referring to early 2000s, like about 2003, when Cisco asked Huawei to stop lifting its intellectual property. Is that the beginning of time that you're talking about?
Yeah, Cisco used to be very big, played a very big role in China's early days, and did China government try to shut its operation down because Cisco is everywhere in every Chinese government agency, banking, and you name it. It's the backbone of China's internet.
Yeah, it's the number one networking equipment in the world. It was, it took off early 2000s. But, I think it's a really good example of how I think the United States tried to play nice. So, for example, in the early days of Huawei's birth into the data networking era, Huawei was caught basically, copying the Cisco equipment, codes right down to the software. And the way they were caught was the fact that the Cisco signature was actually on the software code on the Huawei products. Okay, so they've argued to me, Huawei has argued to me that everyone in the industry, there's a lot of espionage and lifting, fine, but they got caught. Okay. Cisco didn't appreciate it and had to escalate. And so this is, we talked about the WTO, this is when they just had joined. Cisco said, please stop. They didn't stop. Then they escalated into legal terms, and then they settled out of court. That's the whole point. So Cisco didn't clobber Huawei. If you want to look back, it's, hey, if they would have done something more aggressive in those early days, maybe Huawei would exist less so in this industry today, but whatever. So they said no, but it was strategic because Cisco wanted to continue to grow in China because they knew it was this important market. And so this is what I call sandbox sharing. They wanted to make sure that they kept the relationships amicable between the two, right? And so I guess, and then it begs the question of competition. Then Huawei down the road, decade later, accused Cisco of convincing the U.S. government to keep them out of the American market, right? And then that's the beginning of the espionage or the national security issues, et cetera. And then I think and then it just snowballed from there, right? So Huawei was slowly squeezed out of America. And, I think Cisco could have done a lot better in China, let's just say, on an ongoing basis in terms of business. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's the dance that's happening today is who wants to beat their chest at being number one. Are we really able to do this equal market access reciprocation in an even manner? It's not working so far.
Yeah, I think you have answered the question. I guess the bigger question here is, as Paul mentioned, the Washington consensus, free market. You also mentioned free market, should be what the company is going to follow. And the Chinese company has always been accused of engaging in planned economy, command economy. But now it looks like the coin is flipped. U.S. is doing a lot more in the marketplace, and basically. To get Huawei and ZTE and other leading innovative Chinese companies out of the marketplace. So, Paul, your answer to my question.
Great question, and we could do a whole panel just on this question. So, I think one of the basic concepts is that the U.S. export control system, which has been used against Huawei and ZTE, as you mentioned, was really not designed to handle great power competition, okay? It was not designed to handle civil fusion, and it was not designed to handle human rights issues around technology. So it's been this very sort of chaotic process that we've seen where the U.S. has, under the Trump administration, used the entity list, for example, to target these companies. And then this has been a huge disruption into certain kinds of supply chains, particularly semiconductors, because again, these export control laws were really set up to deal with weapons of mass destruction and very small companies that were providing particular types of technologies. They were not designed to deal with big companies like Huawei, like ZTE. And the question is, what is the national security issue here? With WMD, everybody could agree that having other countries get nuclear weapons was bad. Here, the national security issue has not really been well defined by the Biden administration or the Trump administration. It's just China and China competition, or 5G, or China leading on 5G. We haven't really seen a very clear articulation of what the national security issue is that has sort of forced the use of these rules. And in addition, we've seen the U.S. Creatively come up with extensions to things like the entity list. So last year we saw, for example, the rollout of the foreign direct product rule, which is basically the reason that Huawei can no longer compete in both 5G infrastructure and handsets, because it cut off the company from TSMC in Taiwan. And the real concern among that we're looking at is that if the U.S., for example, under the Biden team, decides to extend that foreign direct product rule to other Chinese companies on the entity list, like Phytium, for example, this is a huge issue. And it's pushing up against what I've been calling unknown red lines on Taiwan. So the question is, how will Beijing react to this when we have these known red lines on Taiwan, like diplomatic issues? And, we just had recently the U.S. wants to change the name of TechRo to put Taiwan back in there rather than Taipei. And we've seen arms sales. Those are sort of known red lines. But we don't know in the tech sector where Beijing's red lines are. Beijing has not reacted, as you noted very, very, very sagely there, Yahweh, to all of this action in the tech space. That China has this unreliable entity list. They've passed a number of other regulations which they could use against U.S. companies, for example, operating in China, but they have chosen not to do so because it will further poison the business climate. But Taiwan, once you start throwing Taiwan in there, then you're in a little bit more area of risk. And we've been telling clients this is a big tail risk around Taiwan because we don't know what would happen. And believe me, Washington is talking very much about extending that foreign direct product rule to Chinese companies. In fact, you can make a stronger case against Phytium if the issue is national security defined in a certain way than against Huawei in terms of extending that rule to prevent them from using Taiwan as a manufacturing base. And there are many, many other Chinese companies that are both on the entity list and off the entity list that that could be drawn into this if the U.S. decides to extend this extraterritorial rule, which is huge in the sense that, this has never been done before, where the U.S. is saying, hey, U.S. technology used anywhere in the world to manufacture semiconductors on behalf of X company in China is now requiring a license. That was a huge, huge thing last year that we're still coming to grips with, and that will probably also contributed to the global chip shortage last year in the range of 15 to 20%, depending on who you talk to in industry. So I think the U.S. strategy going forward is going to be interesting to see how it evolves, because there's also a lot of talk of extending multilateral export controls potentially on China via the Trade and Technology Council that I mentioned earlier. The Europeans have also taken a number of steps in this direction, but it's going to be tricky to see how that happens because there's not general support, I think, for cutting off semiconductor manufacturing equipment, for example, from going to China more broadly. But this is going to be another big issue that's going to come up in the short, in the coming months here, is sort of how does the U.S. redefine national security around technology, and how does this then get translated into policies and measures like export controls that industry can understand, right? That's the view of my clients is, everybody understands that there's national security issues, but you have to understand how to comply with those, and do they make sense over the long term, and do they not disadvantage U.S. companies unnecessarily for achieving some fairly nebulous national security goal, for example.
Yeah, that's well said. Nebulous national security issues. If they're not well designed and abused, I think there will be huge obstacles between the relationship. Now, we have lots of questions from the audience, but they are largely divided into two specific kinds. One is what Dennis mentioned about what happened in the last 6 months. Digital era, policy making in digital speed, and the impact on the relationship is also very high speed. The question is, and the Alibaba, Tencent, all these Chinese companies, they're national champions, but now it looks like the government is going after these companies. Is it more a concern with as data security as suggested by you, or the implication is political? And one issue both Dennis and Paul mentioned is China companies access to Western capital. The U.S. said has this Holding Companies Accountable Act, but before that takes effect, China is actually pulling their companies away from being listed, from going IPO. What does this tell us? I want you guys to address this question. The second question is what was also mentioned earlier, is to what extent this Biden administration's alliance strategy is going to work. Amy talked about the UK, Canada, and the US, and Paul talks about the EU. Different countries have different priorities. They certainly don't want to be seen as being part of the US bandwagon, but US is also putting pressure, the Five Eyes, the intelligence. Talking about intelligence, I think American failure of intelligence in Afghanistan is a good example that, that pressure probably could be ignored. What kind of good intelligence you'll be able to share with your allies. But so these are the two questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically ask Paul and Dennis to answer the first one. Are Chinese moves simply regulatory, or there are bigger things behind it? And then the alliance question, I'll pose that to Amy and to Yang, and then we'll go to Dr. Hong to close our session. So why don't you start first, Dennis?
Well, I think that there's the answer is yes, meaning that all of these things are involved. I think that Xi Jinping has a vision in recasting the face of the Chinese economy, and he understands that the digital element of this is becoming increasingly critical as it shapes the next evolution of the economy. And I think that he is, number one, interested in what Chinese consumers are reading, writing, looking at on the internet. I think that there is a political dimension to that. I think there is a benevolent dimension to this also, in the sense that the Chinese leader is supposed to protect the people. And I think that I use the word predatory, e-commerce players. That's the way that they're being seen now. And when you tell me somebody has 30,000 to 100,000 data points about me, I just went back to my Amazon list and said, holy cow, what Amazon could tell you about me simply from just capturing the data in their record about what I bought over the last 3 years, this would be very telling. So I think that that's also very much part of this. I saw this very cute video yesterday about a Chinese villager who was called up on his cell phone by the village chief to get his inoculation for COVID. And this guy went right down to the health bureau, he got his shot, and he said, "Thank you, government, for protecting me from COVID." And I was laughing about this because this was very Chinese, the way that the people and the leadership look at one another. It's totally different than the contract that exists between the people and the government in the United States. And we need to understand something like that the level of tolerance and acceptance for some of this intervention in China is much, much higher than it is in the United States. And so we may look askance at some of it from where we sit, but we've got to put ourselves on the ground back in China more often than not to do this. The thing that worries me is that what Paul and I talked about at the end, really, I'm a person who studies innovation in China. And I remember Tom Friedman about 10 years ago wrote an article, an op-ed piece, in which he talked about two parts to the Chinese economy, the old economy, which coexisted with this new cutting edge economy. And he said that there's a constant tension between it. And I think that this is exactly what it is. We're seeing this tension now come to the surface. And I think it was going in the wrong direction from the way Xi Jinping looked at it. And so when we say it's political, it's not that it comes down on human rights, or it's not that it particularly is aimed at increasing the surveillance state per se. I think it really all has to do with Xi Jinping's vision for what is the good economy going forward. And I think that that's really important. Just one quick more comment. I found that this discussion right before that we had about Huawei is really quite interesting. 5-6 years ago, we'd have been talking about the question, is Huawei really a military company? And does Ren Zhengfei really have military connections? Now we're just talking about Huawei as a competitor in the open commercial market, producing better phones, better switches, better whatever. And this is pure economic competition at its height. And Paul is so right. Export controls, while they're not like the Munitions Act, okay, but they are aimed at, for a defense military, impact. We're not even talking about that. The military fusion issue in that discussion just now didn't even come up really until the very end. So we're really at a very different time with a very different perspective about stopping the Chinese juggernaut. And I think that this is something that we've never done before. Even with the Japanese, I don't remember us going such full bore in trying to halt the 1980s version of what's going on with China today.
Dennis,
should I just add to that?
Sure.
Real quick. On the sort of domestic regulatory front, yes, I think that the real impetus for this is domestic. It's domestic issues that Dennis raises around the predatory nature of big tech, and the idea that Xi Jinping and the Chinese government is not going to tolerate this sort of financialization of the economy and this emphasis on profits over the rights of workers and the rights of delivery people and Uber and DD drivers. It's just not gonna happen. Now it's happening in a sort of disorderly way, and is it coordinated among regulators? I think the biggest issue there is how this is being communicated to the entrepreneurial sector in China that has driven all of this great innovation. And I don't think it's also intended to undermine the business models of all those companies, because those companies are critical to China's tech future going forward. Alibaba and Tencent invest in all these technologies we've been talking about. But I think from my view, looking at it from afar, I think still the bigger issue is that the reason behind this, or really the fundamental reason behind this, is this idea of the need to do this now, because China is going to be in competition with the U.S. going forward here in a very different world, and there's a need to sort of channel the energy and resources towards hard tech and deep tech in a way that China hasn't really done. But again, that's a 10-year thing that's going to take a long time. You can't produce semiconductor manufacturing industry overnight, and it's going to be really tricky. But that's the real idea: China girding for this long-term competition with the United States. The domestic issues are important, obviously, but that sort of in the back of Xi Jinping's mind is that bigger issue.
Yeah, the one bigger issue that's not mentioned here, I think, Dennis, when you said, you've been to Kunshan, you've seen all the Foxconn workers, and now you go there, the workers have disappeared. I think recent policies may be designed to address, the welfare of those disappeared migrant workers. If that's the issue, I think we're all going to be fine because it's largely regulatory. It's the issue of how that is being communicated, to the companies and to the people. But the bigger issue here is, U.S. is pushing so hard on China, and China sees, U.S. threats everywhere that it may propel the Chinese leadership literally to shut down the country. At the same time, to go back to, because they like to talk about, our original intent of the Chinese Communist Party that was founded 100 years ago. What is that original intent? And so I think this assault on private ownership, private property, I don't know. It's my concern. So now we're moving on to Amy and Yang. Obviously I posed you the question, but you if you choose to make different comments, that will be fine. Is the alliance strategy? The Five Eyes. You go to UK. You go to Canada, you go to Singapore, you go to Australia, you say, well, you have to do what we are doing, basically get Huawei out of there or else. Is that going to work with Germany? Is that going to work with France? Is that going to work with the BRI countries? So why don't Dr. Yang go first, and Amy, you'll have the final say today.
Okay, thank you. And first of all, I want to thank the audience for their enthusiasm. I'm sorry for not being able to answer your questions one by one. And I think the United States and Europe, especially the countries you have mentioned above, are likely to form an alliance in terms of technology. And this would drive the strategic competition between China and the United States. The competition would be dragged into the second half of the Rus War. And as I know, the United States strategic circle has long attached great importance to basic technological innovation at the source of the industry, and is committed to controlling the right to formulate international technical standards. Meanwhile, enterprises and private sectors in various countries around the world can operate within their technological framework, thereby firmly controlling the industrial structure and acquiring global monopoly profits. And for the United States, I think the rapid development of companies such as Huawei, ZTE, and Yangtze River shortage technology will undoubtedly impose the catch-up pressure, And for Europe, the both countries you have mentioned represent by, no matter Germany or France, have long ignored the weight of standard setting and gradually lost the right to speak in authoritative organizations such as the International Organizations for Standardization, and the International Electoral Technological Commission, which will regard to the issue of containing, I think with the regard of the issue of containing China's technological development, the interests of United States and Europe are the same. And in the future, the United States and Europe may use the Transatlantic Technology and Trade Council as an foundation, also an opportunity to jointly promote the development of international standards in the field of new technologies, so as to check the balance of the China's influence and right to speak in the global science and technology field. So this is really a challenge to China in the future, in the near future. That's my point. Thank you.
Amy?
Yeah, I guess just really quick, you're saying will the mandate by the U.S. The strong suggestion to not deploy Huawei, will that work with some of the EU countries and with the BRI countries? The short answer is no, not really, not long term. Okay, and it didn't work. It worked a little bit. They kind of thought about it. But I think what really worked is the squeeze that USA did on the supply chain management of the chips to Huawei. So it wasn't just the national security concern that made some countries decide against Huawei. It's actually a business decision. Huawei is not going to be able to supply me necessarily because of this supply chain challenge, i.e. if they can't get the chips from America, whether it's short, medium, or long term, do I really want to invest in their equipment? So I think that it's a short-term tactic. It's not all just about politics. It's been a business decision. Now, what I would say, though, is how do you win over emerging markets? So the whole Belt and Road Initiative is targeting a lot of emerging countries, and I'm sure they'd be ready to play let's make a deal. I think what's happened is China is making really good deals. They're giving them really great offers, and that's why they are open to Huawei, et cetera. And I think it's an opportunity for the West or Western countries and companies to step up their game and have, also offer an offer they cannot refuse. Now, this is and then it comes back to the full circle, the unfair advantage. Can Western companies really compete with the subsidies that the Chinese government is fueling their companies with, et cetera, right? So then we get into the cycle. And that's really, to the earlier question, it's really that, I think that's a little bit of why China got a little bit scared of playing the 100% capitalism game. There's a lot of disclosure required. There's a lot of accountability required. And they're like, oh, I'm not sure I'm not 100% ready to open up all my books and for the world to really see how we're operating, how we're growing, get to my data, et cetera. Let's hunker down a little bit, right? So, but anyway, you asked me about the second question. The question is, if there is a comparable offer, I think there's an opportunity for Western companies to compete. In the emerging markets cannot be ignored. A lot of countries don't favor America, and they have to try harder to win that as a customer base. And I think that was another shortfall of the West, is we really ignored emerging markets. The companies like Huawei and other Chinese companies picked up that low-hanging fruit and took advantage of it. And I think that's the rebalancing. Now, Huawei is beating the 6G drum. So they might just say, hey, you know what? That's fine, America. You can control 5G. I'm just going to focus on 6G, do the leapfrog, and then I'll dominate the world with whatever 6G comes out to be, right? So to be seen. I hope I didn't give China a really great idea, but I'm sure it's not that original. But right, so I don't know. There's an opportunity for us to step up and to win that business.
So Dr. Hong, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. You're such a great moderator as always. And there are a lot of questions in your Q&A box. And Dr. Liu has been very smart to organizing two big categories, and which has been answered well by our panelists. And I would like to thank our four panelists for a great and insightful discussion and interaction among yourself and with the audience. I really learned a lot. There's one common word I heard from all of you: competition, 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 competition. So I keep thinking of a question, whether we will still see any hope or opportunities for international corporations on high technology, particularly on digital frontier. under this background of U.S.-China strategic competition. Hopefully in the near future, we won't see this phenomena existing again, Western bloc on the other hand and China on the other hand. And with that, I would like to thank all participants and from all over the world, particularly for those in China staying with us very late. And looking forward to seeing you again in our next program. Thank you all. Have a very good day. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Yao. Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.